CBC News has confirmed that Trudeau is asking MPs and senators on Parliament's National Security Committee to launch a new investigation into foreign interference in Canada. This detail was first reported by the Canadian press, and sources say this will be just one move in a series of steps the Prime Minister will outline when he speaks later this hour. Trudeau will also announce his government will start consultations on a foreign agent registry. It's all a clear attempt to deal with a controversy that has now lasted for several weeks and sparked multiple calls for a public inquiry. The CBC's Karina Roman has been on this for us all day. She joins me now. So Karina, let's start with that first bit. It's not a public inquiry. It's going to be referred to a National Security Committee of Parliamentarians. That's not what the opposition has been calling for today, is it?
No, and in fact, Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party, the leader of the opposition, was asked about, well, if parliamentarians, in this case, let's just say opposition leaders, could see what intelligence we're dealing with, would that be enough? And he said, well, no, because I'd be sworn to secrecy and then I can't talk about it. Well, it's the same with this National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. Yes, all parties get to see what we're talking about and in greater detail, but they can't then discuss it with the public. And you know, both the Conservatives and the NDP, the reason they've said that they want a public inquiry is they want a process as transparent and open as possible. And they believe that a lot of this material is not stuff that has to be secret, that the knowledge that, you know, Canadians, the general public, could have about what kind of tactics have been engaged upon, what actually is happening, will help the public be able to deter and fight back against it. You know, if voters know when they're being targeted, or MPs or candidates know when they're being targeted and what those tactics are, you know, the Conservatives argue that is actually something that CSIS recommends in terms of fighting against you know, those activities, and so this, I can't imagine that the Conservatives are going to come out saying, okay, thanks, this is perfect, this is what we asked for. It's far from what they asked for.
Yeah, it is the recommendation, oddly enough, of Fred Delory, the guy who ran the Conservative campaign in the last election, because he said on this show last week that a public inquiry would be good political theater, but for speed and urgency and to get the reforms you need, NSICOP, as this committee is known as, is the correct vehicle to do that. So obviously this will not satisfy the political demands. The second component of information that we have that the Canadian press is also reporting is that the government will start consultations on a foreign agent registry. Now, this is something the United States has had since the 1930s, that Australia has had since 2018. And Karina, this is something the government has promised to do, but it's sort of ragged the puck a little bit on even starting the consultation. So this is starting a process that people already think is fairly overdue.
Well, yeah, clearly this is, you know, due to the pressure of the situation. The story is not going away. You know, the demands for public inquiry certainly weren't going away. The committee still wants to look into this. And so, you know, in terms of the foreign registry, I should mention the UK is also, I believe there's a bill before the UK Parliament to look at this as well. So, you know, our greatest allies either have this in place or are looking at it. It had long been promised by the Liberals. As you mentioned, perhaps they were ragging the puck. Perhaps you just needed this impetus or this pressure to push forward with what are now consultations. We don't know how long those will take. But it'll be interesting to see what they decide to put forward if they do put forward something with a foreign registry because of agents, because it works. It's similar between the Australian and the U.S., obviously, but there are differences. So it'll be interesting to see what model they decide might work for Canada.
And the value of that, Karina, just so people know at home, a foreign agent registry requires people who act on behalf of a foreign government outside of diplomatic means to register with the federal government their activities. And then if they are meddling in an election, it's hard to prove some of these election violations. But if you don't register, that is a violation, and that then becomes a way for law enforcement to prosecute, not based on intelligence. Because one of the challenges that we're dealing with in all of this is that intelligence isn't necessarily evidence. So this becomes one more tool for law enforcement to use.
Exactly, because there are penalties, stiff penalties, if you don't register, regardless of what the activities are. And if you don't register and you're involved somehow in if not interference in political activity, you know, it begs the question, why did you not register? Then it sort of makes it suspicious, right? So you know, the hefty penalties in both Australia and the U.S. speak to how, you know, the deterrent of having people not do that and to register and be open about their activities.
Okay, Karina, thanks so much for following the bouncing ball with us on this breaking news. That's the CBC's Karina Roman live for us tonight in Ottawa. Okay, so what is Beijing's end goal, and how could these latest measures about to be announced address the allegations of election interference? We want to bring in an expert on this. Joanna Chu is the author of China Unbound, A New World Disorder, and has been covering the Chinese government for a decade. And she joins me now. Joanna, it's good to talk to you again. I just first get your reaction to this latest news about the Prime Minister, the Foreign Agent Registry, starting the process on that and asking a National Security Committee to do another investigation into foreign interference.
It does seem like Trudeau is responding to an unprecedented level of public pressure on this issue. I and many others have been reporting on these stories for quite some time, and there's been a pretty consistent level of frustration among sources I speak to that they've been testifying to Parliament, speaking with government for the last several decades, and not seeing movement on this case. Right now, Canada does not have a dedicated team or protocols that involve cooperation between CSIS, police, and government on countering foreign interference. So what people are telling me is that while a public inquiry or these measures are welcome, they hope that what comes next is a whole of government approach, because a lot of what the CSIS leaked reports are saying are actually not even secrets or a surprise to many in the community. They say it's been open knowledge for a long time.
Right. So let's talk about this. I mean, it's open knowledge in the diaspora community. Sherry Wong, who we had on the show Friday, basically said the rest of us who are surprised have been living under a rock, I believe was the exact phrase that she used. So what is the end goal here for Beijing when interfering in Canadian elections? What is it that they're trying to get out of all of this activity?
Yeah, I think an attitude among some Canadians is that why would China put so many resources into trying to infiltrate and influence Canada? You know, we're a relatively small country with not that much clout internationally. Well, actually, Canada and other countries like Australia, UK, US, where many Chinese immigrants have settled, are actually key targets for China. China sees places with large numbers of overseas Chinese communities as particularly dangerous to Beijing because we have the language skills, we have the cultural and family connections back in China. So they see people in these countries as posing a disproportionate threat to internal political stability in China. So since the 80s, there's been media reporting, books, articles about ways that China's United Front Work Department, an actual official bureau employing thousands of people in China, have been trying to leverage their international networks to either co-opt through things like economic enticements or to threaten with harassment of family and friends back in China to try to compel people around the world to help serve its political interests.
So with the reports we've seen, and I'm not going to ask you to speak to the veracity of these reports because I don't know if you have a line of sight into this, but the allegations are that MPs or senators or parliamentarians have been targeted for influence. What's the value of one single MP who may be friendly to China in a parliament of 338 MPs that's set to grow? What is China seeking in targeting someone to be a potential asset like that?
So we have one MP named in the recent stories, Liberal MP Han Dong, but previous reporting has identified 11 federal candidates receiving these undeclared cash donations. And this is on the federal level, and this is the latest reporting, but we know that from the city council level in small towns, in cities such as Vancouver, where city councilors and the mayor have in the past talked about receiving this pressure, that this is happening across Canada at all levels of government. In fact, it's harder to try to influence someone at the federal national level. It's a lot easier to try to entice someone who is a smaller town or smaller city's councilor or mayor to act in ways that are friendly to the Chinese government. And smaller jurisdictions actually have more influence on Canada that China is interested in, like land use rights, education partnerships. What China is wanting to do is that they want to influence the narrative on China in Canada across society. So actually smaller level politicians who can approve things like Confucius Institutes in our schools, business partnerships, sister city relations. They're actually very of interest to Beijing.
It's interesting that it's so pervasive across all these levels, and the focus right now is strictly on the federal level because of the controversy and the way it's exploded here. And that's where most of the attention is, right? So, like, how does the country even come to grips with this if it's at small much lower municipal levels, which don't get the same media scrutiny and the same level of attention as like a national election gets, and so many of us missed it at the federal level?
Yeah. So a lot of unfortunately, our Chinese language media in Canada that are operated by Canadians have already come under decades of pressure by Chinese consulates. Former newspaper editors like Singtao Daily editor Victor Ho has been very frank about all the pressure that he's come under as a former editor of Canada's largest Chinese language newspaper to toe the line and not write reports that are critical of China. And this is unfortunate because I think our richest wealth of information is and remains to be Chinese Canadians. There are still a few that are willing to speak up, and they've been outspoken about how in order to continue speaking and feeding information to CSIS and the government, they've had to pretty much cut all ties to their family back in China. I just spoke with someone for an article for The Star coming out today, Mehmet Toti, a Uyghur Canadian. He said he received a call from Chinese police as recently as January, where police back in Xinjiang said that 2 of his sisters are dead and his cousin could be next. As far as he knows, his sisters are still alive, his cousin is still alive, but it's at that level of very direct and frightening threats that Canadians are getting because of their activism, their research in Canada. Mehmet was quite involved in getting and lobbying the parliament to accept 10,000 more Uyghur refugees. And the timing checked out for when he got that call was right before a parliament vote approving this new acceptance of refugees.
It seems like there's multiple issues here, right? There's the attempt to interfere in the election, right, which is obviously what the politicians are focused on here, but there's this persistent cycle of intimidation and pressure on the diaspora population. So I wonder, like, is a public inquiry the right way to deal with this? Is it, is it this National Security Committee that's going to look at it? I mean, you mentioned a whole of government response earlier, but make me see that. What does that look like?
So, for example, and we have to keep in mind that intimidation, extraterritorial activities aren't just coming from China. They're coming, and CSIS have said, from Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran. I've been tracking also incidents of Indian police trying to intimidate and open files into Canadians, particularly of Sikh heritage. So this is happening and has been reported. I think we have to kind of change the narrative that these are secrets that necessarily require a public inquiry to be aired out in public, because it's been reported piecemeal, and we can kind of collect all of this information, and Canadians should right now do their part to seek out and educate themselves. But what's happening, I think there's a need for this whole of government approach, because when people experience harassment, their first call and what they're being advised to do is go report to local police. So if you live in the GTA, you're, say, Mississauga, you're supposed to go report to Mississauga police. And that really requires all levels of police and government to be aware of what's happening. But what has happened instead is that, source after source has told me to go to their local police in any province in Canada. And some of the time, their reports are not even accepted. Police don't know what to do with these allegations that intimidation is coming from outside the country. How do you investigate that? I've personally reported death threats to myself because of my reporting. And police told me quite honestly that it would take someone on my front lawn with a machete for them to come and do something about it. It's hard for Canadian courts to approve police getting things like IP addresses to track where some of these threats are coming from. So even if police want to help and they're aware of some of the cultural and political context, they really don't have the legal tools at their disposal to try to investigate.
What would you like to hear from the Prime Minister today specifically? I don't think you're going to get the whole of government response out of him today. We know some of what it's going to be. We're told there are other measures. But if there's one thing that the Chinese-Canadian community would like to hear from Justin Trudeau tonight, what do you think it might be?
Well, I think the main thing that has been quite offensive to Chinese Canadians is the idea that it's not just Trudeau saying it, it's been, a kind of a refrain for years, right from 2010 when former CSIS head Dick Fadden tried to warn of foreign interference from China, and he was called racist, and MPs called for him to step down as CSIS head. And then again, with these allegations about MP candidate Han Dong, Trudeau said it was racist to question his loyalties. And actually this idea that investigating these allegations is racism because Chinese people of Chinese ethnicity might be involved is almost word by word a Beijing line. It's a common, I lived in Beijing, I often ask questions to the foreign ministry, and they would say things like, you're being racist to question and investigate and look into what is happening. You're singling out the Chinese. So I think Chinese Canadians are kind of sick of this kind of deflection, they would say, and they would like to have foreign interference be taken seriously, and for there to be a recognition that for decades, a lot of the intelligence that CSIS has gathered, it came from these tips that the Chinese diaspora has risked their safety and the safety of their families to provide for the Canadian government and spy agencies. So I think they would like to see a recognition of their contributions, and that taking it seriously is actually not racist. It's actually listening to and seeing these kind of long-held frustrations from the diverse community of Chinese immigrants in Canada.
Right, meet their courage with some urgency. Joanna Chu, your work on this has been exceptional. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. This is Joanna Chu with the Toronto Star.
Thank you.
On Parliament Hill today, MPs faced off for the first time since various leaks were made to media alleging Chinese election interference.
For 10 years, the communist dictatorship in Beijing has been helping the Prime Minister. He's done absolutely nothing to stop it because he benefits from it. Will he finally allow a public and truly independent investigation of it?
Just because the Leader of the Opposition keeps insisting on a falsehood doesn't make it real. He knows very well, Mr. Speaker, that our government took unprecedented steps to deal with this issue because we take it seriously.
Opposition parties aren't alone in their calls for a public inquiry. Earlier today, we spoke with a member of the Chinese-Canadian diaspora before we heard about these new measures that the Prime Minister will be announcing later this hour. Fenella Sung is the founding convener of the Canadian Friends of Hong Kong. Fenella, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, David.
You say there needs to be a public inquiry into this issue. Why do you think it's important for that to happen?
We need to go to the bottom of it. As a Canadian, we need to know our democracy, what's working and what's not working right now, because there is a very serious allegation saying that our democracy being threatened. Some foreign powers are trying to undermine it and also allegedly being compromised. So as Canadians, we need to know actually how our system works and where is it broken, if any. And also, as Chinese Canadians, I think it's really important to know who are the culprits in our community, if there's any. And also, who are the ones that have dealings or untoward dealings with foreign agency, especially those among us elected officials. So for the sake of the entire Chinese Canadian community, I think it's also important, because otherwise this whole suspicion will be shrouded upon the entire Chinese community, which is not good for anyone. And also to those being named or being alleged saying that they have done something wrong, it will do them justice if they really have done nothing wrong. Ask them to come clean. Tell us actually what happened. What do you do? And what's your activities with any of those kind of foreign agents? What is your professional way or the natural, normal behavior?
Right.
As a politicians, we need to know all this, go to the bottom of it. I think it's just fair and do just for everyone.
So you mentioned suspicion on the Chinese-Canadian community because you've warned of a backlash against the Chinese-Canadian population because of this issue. What are you seeing that backlash? What are you seeing there?
Actually, I see that we are in a triple whammy situation, 3 levels. First of all, as Canadians, as I just say, we see our democracy being threatened and allegedly being compromised. So that's one thing. And on the other level, we, as Chinese Canadians, we are particularly vulnerable and the easiest targets to the Chinese influence here. So that's why we need to come clean, and also people will need to come clean and also tell us exactly what happened so that we know who are the culprits. And thirdly, if we don't rule out those culprits, that's exactly what you're talking about. The racist backlash and the rising anti-Asian sentiments will be upon every one of us in the Chinese community, and as well as for the Asian Canadian community as well. But going back to the inquiry, I think it's a very complex issue that we need to take one step at a time, because you are not going to go to the bottom of it if you draw in the Russians, the Iranians, and everything. So we have to do it fast before the next election. We have to narrow down to the 2019 and 2021 elections at the operation level, because the allegations are money changed hands, international students, business people, politicians, political parties, and all writings, all these are involved. So we need to know exactly what happened during those elections, and at the grassroots level, at the operation level as well. So we need to hold the political top leadership and the political parties accountable if anything's done wrong. We need to fix the loopholes. Okay. And also, we need to have people go into the election without this suspicion and doubts in mind. Then those we need to do before the next election. Then we go to the next step of the very comprehensive scrutiny, going into actually what infiltration at what level of the government, at what academic institutions, companies have they infiltrated. Then we talk about the next step.
Okay, Fennell, I want to touch on something you referenced there, and that's anti-Asian racism, because the Prime Minister referenced this as a concern coming out of the controversy of the last couple of weeks, especially as it pertains to the allegations against Liberal MP Han Dong. What's your reaction to the Prime Minister's comments about his concerns about anti-Asian racism playing a role in all of this?
I think if we don't go to the bottom of it, then his fear will materialize. Actually, the other way around is I don't think it's racist to ask legitimate questions of our elected officials, because be it the Prime Minister as an MP, be it Mr. Dong, or your MP in your riding, my MP in my riding, we use the same lens to judge and to assess whether there are any improper behaviors when they are dealing with foreign agents or anyone in the ridings. Are political donations legitimate? Are they being suspicious? We ask the same questions of everyone. So it's not Mr. Dong, and it's not racist to ask those legitimate questions at all.
I wonder, Fennell, if you can give us a sense what your experience might be with how the Chinese Communist Party tries to influence Canadian elections, and in particular, the type of pressure you may see or the influence attempts you may see against members of the Chinese Canadian community. What's your firsthand insight into that?
Okay, actually, it's not just my personal experience, because we see a pattern out of many other places as well, notably the Australian elections, the United Kingdom, the Taiwanese elections, the elections in Hong Kong. We see a playbook, we see a similar pattern there. They started with personal relationship, very subtle. But after they get to know you, then they give you maybe, honey traps, money traps, anything, or even, on friendship basis, can you do me a favor with this? And also misinformation and disinformation also help their campaign. Look at the situation of Mr. Kenny Chiu in Richmond, BC. Those are the misinformation, twisted things around, distorted facts, and then they just kind of give you some insights quote unquote, and saying that, okay, this is the guy that we favor, and when he get elected, he will have he will do things favorable to both you and I as well as our community. Many people, they don't follow news as much as you and I do. So that's why very easily being misled and being rushed. And those are the things that we need to know at the community level. But on the other hand, we see as what CBC's alleged saying, we see large sums of money change hands at the political donations level. So that's why I think goes back to the thing is that what are the boundaries? What are the ethical boundaries, professional boundaries, personal boundaries when we are dealing with those kind of things? Like the Pierre Trudeau Foundation, the $200,000, actually it's not illegal for them to take those donations. It's a private donation given by a private business person. It's nothing wrong in that sense. But why are they returning the money? It's just because of the optics, because of the public expectation. I think we need to build up those kind of trust. Otherwise, people will be seen as, you have breached my trust. I put my faith in you. I put my vote in you as elected official, but you have breached my trust. I think it's that kind of thing that we need to deal with as well.
Fenella Sung, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, David.